how to understand the ophthalmological conditions or eye conditions or eye movement disorders leading to neurological illness. So something that we all know about is primary eye movements in the 9 cardinal positions of gaze. So we know that the eyes can move towards your right side gaze, your left side gaze, up gaze, down gaze, the in gaze or the vergence. And we also know that some children can have unusual eye deviations known as squint or strabismus. It could be an in deviation known as esotropia, or it could be an out deviation known as exotropia. And some children can have fast eye movements, to and fro jerky eye movements. We had seen that in the last session as well, known as nystagmus. Now, in this particular talk or today's talk, I will be, of course, briefly discussing about all these things that we all know in a systematic manner. So what we would try to see is that we will try to understand some of the basics of the normal eye movements. How does eye moves left, right, up and down? We will try to understand certain steps in the ophthalmological examination in a stepwise manner so that we can derive maximum information. And I will outline about the eye movements which are reduced, basically the paralysis and the palsies or hypokinetic eye movement disorders, and very unusual eye movements in which the eye movements are increased, known as hyperkinetic eye movement disorders. So these are the 3 basic headlines or 3 basic themes I want to discuss today. So we'll go one by one. So let's see some, before that, we'll just probably discuss a case so that we'll have some as a starter so that you know what we are going to do in this particular discussion. Okay, so this is one example of a 6-year-old boy who had like acute to subacute onset of double vision, both right side and left side, and difficulty in walking, falls while walking, difficulty in climbing up stairs, difficulty in climbing up from sitting position, and almost like a weakness of around 15 to 20 days duration. It was gradually progressive. The weakness which was there in the first week progressed to the second week, and by the third week he was non-ambulatory. So with the symptoms, when we start examining the child after our detailed neurological examinations of higher mental function as a part of cranial nerve examination, when we start examining the eyes, in the cardinal position itself, both of his eyes are indeviated, okay? But when we are asking to look towards the right side, there is a definitive restriction of the right eyes toward the lateral gaze. And when we ask to look towards the left side or the left side of the gaze, there is a definitive restriction of the left eyeball to the lateral gaze on the left side, meaning by there is a bilateral lateral gaze paralysis or palsy. So how do we analyze this case? So once you examine the other parts of the neurological examination, your tone, your power, your reflexes, and also do some other steps of eye examination like the fundus, the pupils, you would have a reasonable idea of what could be the etiology, right? So like in entire neurology, localization begins by clearly trying to understand your symptoms and try to locate it anatomically, whether it is an upper motor neuron or a lower motor neuron, and then try to form a pattern. So that's what we try to do in this case. So this child had a hypokinetic eye movements with double vision. All of us have understood bilateral lateral gaze palsy with restriction and abduction. So meaning by there is a bilateral 6th nerve gaze palsy, right? And the fundus is normal and the cranial nerves 2 to 12 are intact. So there is no papilledema, but there is a bilateral 6th nerve palsy. And when you start further examining the child with the other part of the neuroaxis, you understand that he is flaccid, he is quadriparetic with a poor tone, he is hypotonic, his reflexes are not elicitable, and he is having a power which is around 2/5 in the lower limbs and 3/5 in the upper limbs. So that's a clear gradient between the lower limbs and the upper limbs. And there is some sort of a weak gag as well. So he's having some degree of weak gag or pooling of secretion. So you understand that he's having a generalized weakness in addition to your bilateral 6th nerve paralysis. So if you want to put it anatomically, so we have a child who's having a progressive subacute onset flaccid paraparalysis with involvement of bilateral 6th cranial nerves. So it's a generalized polyneuropathy with involvement of your cranial nerves with areflexia. And this would predominantly point to a lower motor neuron type of lesion. And when you put all this together, you know a picture of a lower motor neuron type of a flaccid paralysis with a bilateral abduction palsy is likely to be a Guillain-Barré syndrome. And you investigate accordingly with a nerve conduction study and with your ganglioside antibodies. So the final diagnosis becomes a Miller-Fisher type of Guillain-Barré syndrome with ophthalmoparesis and flaccid quadriparesis. So this case is in a nutshell of how we would be looking at today's sessions. In a child, we have to look at the eye examination, of course, and which I'll be telling you in detail, but we also have to look at the other part of the neurological axis and try to make one complete picture, a picture in toto. So there are three levels in reaching a diagnosis. The first level is about understanding the symptom, how it was the onset, how was the progression, and what is the nature or impact of a particular symptom in terms of whether it's a hypokinetic or a hyperkinetic eye movement disorder. And then you try to examine the eyes in detail, the pupils, the fundus, the eye movements, and you examine the other neurological axis, right, like we have done in this child, and you try to form a pattern. Once you have formed a pattern, you can have a directed investigations to reach the diagnosis. So what are the basics of eye movement? So we'll go in three parts. The first part is about basics of eye movements. The second part is about examination of hypokinetic eye movements, and the third part is examination of hyperkinetic eye movement disorder. So all of us know what is the purpose of your normal eye movements. Our purpose of our eyes is to have a vision, which means once we see a target, we need to fix at a target, and if it required, we need to follow a target as well. So fixing at a target and following a target is primarily the goals of having a good vision in by which your images have a proper fusion, retinal fusion, and the images are transmitted to your occipital cortex. So in order to have a good degree of fixation to a visual target and fusion to a visual target, you need to have a very good control of eye movements, which are done not only by your brainstem or your pons or your the medulla or the midbrain, but also diffusely by the entire neuroaxis. So the eye movements, as you know, I mean, if I want to simplify, there are monocular eye movements and binocular eye movements. So when you look at single eyes, you close one eyes and examine the right eye and the left eye independently, they are called as monoocular eye movements or adductions. But when you want to check both the eye movements together, they are called as conjugate eye movement or versions. So you can have a conjugate eye gaze to the right and a conjugate eye gaze to the left, which involves synchronized movement between the right eyes and the left eye. And if you want to break this synchrony, and if you want to have in an unusual axis, that is like looking at the tip of the nose, your both eyes should come inward, by which we break the normal axis of moving in a smooth line. And this sort of movement in which your both eyes, work in an opposite direction, like moving inwards to look at the your tip of the nose, is known as your vergence or disconjugate eye movements. So in summary, we have three types of eye movements: monocular eye movements, binocular eye movements. Monocular eye movements are known as adductions. Binocular eye movements are known as versions. Okay. And disconjugate binocular eye movements are called as vergence. So as I told you, your eye movement is controlled almost diffusely by the entire neuroaxis. It can be your right from your cerebral cortex, your frontal eye field, your occipital cortex, okay, your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, your parieto-temporal occipital junction. It could be your basal ganglia, or it could be your cerebellum, right? So your eye movements, like as I told you in the last previous sessions, any movement requires some form of intention, decision making, programming, planning, and execution. So it's not just that you carry out a movement like lifting a water bottle just like that. You need to think about it, you need to plan about it. There is some degree of programming and there is some degree of execution. So in that way, the supranuclear control of eye movements is pretty complex, in that you have the decision making by your cerebral cortex, but programming and planning and smoothing by your basal ganglia and cerebellar networks, and execution, which are then relayed from your cortico-brainstem networks, that is from your corticobulbar pathways towards your brainstem. So supranuclear movements are pretty complex. I'm not going into the details, but as you can see in this particular cartoon, you have varied levels of control of eye movements, right? Like if there is a lesion, a big lesion in your thalamus or a big lesion in your cerebral cortex, you can have an eye movement disorder. if you have a lesion in your cerebellum or your basal ganglia, you can have an eye movement disorder. Okay, so you need to remember this, that the control is diffuse. But if you have control right from your brainstem, that is nuclear, and internuclear, that is the connection between two different nuclei, like the sixth nerve and the third nerve nuclei, or if you have the cranial nerves, then the symptoms are usually localized only to the eyes, and usually a nuclear lesion or a cranial nerve lesion leads to a complete paralysis of eye movements known as palsies. Whereas your internuclear, the connection between your sixth nerve and the third nerve nuclei by the middle longitudinal fasciculus, lesions usually causes conjugate gaze palsies but do not produce a complete monoocular eye palsy. So these are some of the basics. You need to revise and brush these basics. Generally, a nuclear lesion would cause a complete palsy, but it is usually accompanied by neighborhood signs of the tracts, passing through your brainstem tracts. Whereas your cranial nerve lesions like sixth nerve and third nerve and fourth nerve produces monoocular palsies, right? So the nuclei control of your eye movements involves your midbrain pons and the medulla, right? Whereas your internuclear connections is by means of medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is a long bundle which runs from hypothalamus down up to your cervical cord, medulla and cervical cord. And then you have the infranuclear by means of cranial nerves, oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, and abducens nerve. That is your cranial nerves. So there are certain basic terms related to your eye movements. Once you have understood that there are different areas which would control different aspects of your eye movements, we could cut down it further and refine it further to understand the nuances. So once you want to fix a target, as I told you, the ultimate purpose of eye movement is to fix a target and follow a target. In order to fix a target, your eyes should remain static in one particular position. Okay, static. It should remain very much fixed, which is known as gaze holding. So your gaze holding is contributed by your pons, medulla, and your cerebellum. Again, I'm not going into your anatomical details, but if you understand once, if there is an issue in your gaze holding, if you're not able to hold your gaze towards one particular target, your eyes can randomly move about to and fro, and which logically could explain your nystagmatoid eye movements. So our impairment of gaze holding leads to nystagmus. But if you want to follow a target, your eyes should move, okay, smoothly, but sometimes it also requires your eyes to jump from one position to another position, and this jumping of eyes from one position to eye position is achieved by means of small jerks known as saccades. Okay, so the saccades are those small jerks that initiates the eyes to a target, and these are controlled by your frontal lobe. The areas within the frontal lobe are known as frontal eye fields. Okay, so just imagine if you're not able to initiate your eye movements as small jerks towards a particular target, instead of moving your eyes, you would move your head towards the target and look at the target. Okay, this sort of unusual head thrusting movements is seen in oculomotor apraxia. I'll come to that later. So the other aspect of eye movements is a very smooth and a gentle linear movement of eyes from one end to the another end in a 180-degree angle. Like for example, if you want to see a moving target from your right end of the gaze to the left end of the gaze, that sort of the smooth eye movement called a smooth pursuit is coordinated and facilitated by paretotemporo-occipital junction networks to influencing your brainstem. So in case if you're not having your smooth pursuit, again, you can have issues in fixing and following a target. And sometimes this smooth pursuit can be interrupted by intrusive or external movements like saccades or nystagmatoid eye movements as well. So saccades are jerky movements. Impairment of saccades can cause difficulty initiating jerky movements. You can have oculomotor apraxia. And if the smooth pursuit is impaired, you may have saccadic intrusion, or the child may again show head thrusting movements. And the role of eye is to fix a target, and if there is an impairment of fixation, you may have unusual to and fro jerky movements known as nystagmus. So accordingly, this comes to the second part of our discussion. The eye movements can be broadly classified into the movements in which the eye movements are restricted or is weak, known as paresis or palsy. So you can have the third nerve palsy, fourth nerve palsy, and sixth nerve palsy, causing different types of oculomotor weaknesses and different types of squint. Or you can have Individual eye movements being normal, monocular, but your conjugate or synchronized eye movements may be affected, called as gaze palsies, which can be seen in certain conditions with encephalopathy or certain conditions involving your internuclear medial longitudinal fasciculus pathway. You can have weakness which is fluctuating and episodic, like in myasthenia gravis, or you can have weakness which is again episodic and fluctuation, like in case of a mitochondrial disorder, right? So these are some of the conditions in which there are restricted eye movements, and there are certain more conditions in which there are increased frequency or unwanted, abnormal, intrusive eye movements like ocular opsoclonus, ocular flutter, spasmus nutans, and nystagmus. So we'll be seeing about a few of these conditions in detail. So the examination of the eyes, you need appropriate tools, you need a good setting. Your ambient light should be good. At least we need a basic torch light, and we need an ophthalmoscope. And for small kids and neonates, we would be needing distractors like toys, red color objects, and so on. So the examination, of course, begins before the examination. Of course, you need to have some idea about the background medical information, which you would take from the birth history, the developmental history, and the risk factor history and family history, and so on. This could give an idea about acquired or genetic or inherited conditions. Sometimes the child could have a pure ophthalmological inherited conditions like retinitis pigmentosa, which could mimic like or which could present to a neurological OPD. So you should have a clear idea about the background status of the child. And when you start about the symptom about pertaining to your eyes per se, okay, we should be very clear about how the symptoms started and how did it progress, and whether that particular ophthalmological symptom has any other associated neurological symptom as well. So the ophthalmological symptoms or which do come to the neurology practice are usually vision loss and double visions, or unusual eye movements and unusual eye position. Okay, so again, if the vision loss is very dramatic in onset, very sudden, you should think about trauma, or we should think about a vascular cause, okay, leading to a sudden visual loss. But if it's a painful visual loss, you think about inflammatory conditions like optic neuritis. You have to know whether the vision loss is complete or incomplete to further know, to further think about your differential diagnosis. If it's a double vision, you need to know, if the double vision involves with just one eye, like a monoocular double vision, which clearly implies that the problem is an ocular illness rather than a neurological illness. Something like a lens detachment or a retinal detachment can cause a monoocular double vision. But if you have a binocular double vision, which is more prominent in one particular direction of gaze, it usually means a neurological gaze palsy. Okay, and then you need to clarify how the double vision increases, whether it is more to near objects or whether it is more to far objects. Like if you want to see near objects, we need to have a good convergence mechanism and medial recti. So if there is a diplopia which is more to a near vision, it means that probably is there in the third nerve pathways is where the problem lies. And when you want to see at a far distance, we need our eyes to be diverged. And so if you have a diplopia more to a distant vision, it means probably it is the anatomical networks point out towards your sixth nerve, cranial nerve, and their networks, right? So to any specific side, towards the lateral gaze again indicates a sixth nerve related double vision. Towards the medial side indicates a double vision pertaining to your third nerve nuclei or third cranial nerve. Okay, so these are some of the information that we can try to get. Of course, in smaller children, it is impossible, nearly impossible to get all relevant information. So you can have drooping of eyelids in certain neurological conditions or neuromuscular illnesses, where if you have an episodic ptosis, you think about conditions involving your neuromuscular junctions like myasthenia gravis or a mitochondrial disorder. Again, if it is very constant droopy eyelids, you may think about a congenital ptosis, where it becomes a purely ophthalmological illness. So there is some degree of overlap between neurology and neuro-ophthalmology. Some purely ophthalmological cases do end up coming to neurological OPD, but we need to clarify the history here. That's where the history taking becomes very, very important. And what is the overall quality of movements? Do you find any intrusive movements? And what happens next to the neurological system after understanding the eye system, you should know what happens to the neurological system. For example, a child having unusual eye movements or rapid eye movements, if also has unusual rapid movements in the limbs and the body, you think about a cerebellar illness like opsoclonus or some other movement disorder. Right. So also always think about what are the associated neurological illness. Is the child having encephalopathy? Is he comatose? Is he having altered sensorium? Is he having brief and sudden eye movements associated with loss of sensorium, where you think about conditions like seizures or channelopathies and so on. Right. So there is no end in you analyzing your history. It requires more practice, but you need to go stepwise and try to get history as relevant and as detailed as possible. So once you have taken salient history, we need some 2 or 3 clear questions in mind to reach a proper and a reasonable diagnosis. So the first question is always about the onset, very acute onset being related to trauma or vascular. Subacute to progressive onset is usually either demyelination or tumor, and whether it's progressive or static. In progressive, then the differentials are very wide, from tumor to degenerative conditions to autoimmune conditions. But if it is static, you may think about congenital and genetic conditions which are behaving like very static, right? Again, if the illness is only monoocular or binocular conditions or monoocular, again, to localize. If it's monoocular, you may think there is more importance in localizing, as I have told you in my previous classes as well. Any neurological signs which is localizing or lateralizing to one side requires more anatomical inputs. You need to think about more anatomically, right? So once you have understood what is the onset and whether the eyes is involving one eye or both eye, the third step would be to understand the other neurological comorbidities and deficits overall. Okay. So if there is no other neurological deficits, symptoms are pertaining only to the eye, right? Then again, of course, it could be a central cause or a primary ocular cause. You need further examination details. But at each and every step, whether it's monocular or binocular, or whether it is like child having other neurological comorbidities, always think about anatomy. Where is the lesion? Is the lesion supranuclear, the cerebral cortex, cerebellum, basal ganglia, thalamus and their networks, or is it nuclear at the level of brainstem, or is it infranuclear at the level of cranial nerves? So these are some of the 4 key questions or anatomical questions that you need to keep in your mind to reach a diagnosis. So general physical examination offers many clues to the eye which is trained. Okay, so general physical examination offers many clues to an eye that is trained. So the first impression can give a lot of information, especially if the child is dysmorphic, the child is having some skin manifestations like telangiectasia and so on. You will be able to identify certain clues. Okay, so dysmorphism, microcephaly, macrocephaly, prominent anterior fontanelle, neurocutaneous markers like telangiectasia, hemangiomas. Okay, the overall quality of movements, whether the child is Parkinson, hypokinetic with bradykinesia, or whether the child is showing chorea and dystonia and athetosis and so on. So the overall quality of movements also gives a clue with regards to your ophthalmological condition. And one interesting thing or one important thing, these children, especially those children who have palsies, okay, either a monoocular palsy or a binocular palsy, could have is known as a head tilt towards one side or a head tremor towards one side. So if you see a particular head tilt towards one side, it could be of a localizing value in terms of neuroanatomy of how to localize a particular cranial nerve lesions. Okay, like for example, in a case of a fourth nerve palsy, the head tilt is always to the opposite side. Okay, in a case of a trochlear nerve palsy, for example, if there is a left trochlear nerve palsy, there is a head tilt always to the right side. Okay, it will be like a torticollis towards the right side. So if there is a congenital tilt, for example, you may have some degree of retrocollis with bilateral 6 nerve palsies. Okay, so similarly, congenital nystagmus children, in addition to having nystagmus, can also have some degree of head tremor. So these are the points that you can observe while you are having a general physical examination. And going further, you may look for bruit. If there is like bilateral complete ophthalmoparesis, you can presence of a bruit over the orbits. Okay, you check for the bruit over your supraorbital ridge, the lateral aspect of your supraorbital ridge with the bell of the stethoscope. And the presence of an orbital bruit indicates probably there is a carotidocavernous fistula, very rare and unusual condition. But if you are able to pick up it could indicate the lesion intracranially. And you may sometimes look at the mouth to look for like hard necrotizing ulcer over the palate, which can indicate probably a nasopharyngeal carcinoma involving the palate and extending up intracranially to cause multiple cranial nerve palsies. You may look at a palatal myoclonus, which can give an idea of an occult movement disorder causing unusual eye movement disorder as well. You can look at the thyroid gland. Okay, a thyroid gland is notorious to produce ophthalmoparesis. Okay, especially in young adults and teenagers. Okay, with an acquired hypothyroidism. So presence of a thyroid bruit or an enlarged thyroid gland can give a clue to a thyroid eye disease. So these are some basic information what we can look for. As a pediatric neurologist, we are probably more interested in the genetics and the dysmorphology of a child, which can give multiple clues towards a underlying neurological illness. Like in this child, for example, as you can see, this child is having a large head with a bulging anterior fontanelle, and you can see eyes in the cardinal position is downward placed, or a downward type of a squint. Okay, with a restriction of up gaze. So this type of movements you can see in two scenarios. Once you can see in a child with kernicterus having up gaze palsy, or you can see in a child who's having hydrocephalus with a macrocephaly and a bulging anterior fontanelle, causing paralysis of up gaze because of pressure in the tectum of your midbrain. Okay, so these sort of signs, okay, like up gaze palsy or a sunsetting eyes, okay, can be noted with your first impression. And sometimes you can see a very typical facial, almost like a flat face with less expressions, lack of smile, with a bilateral esotropia in a dysmorphic kid. You know that in addition to sixth nerve weakness, there is a seventh nerve palsy as well. So this would give a clue that this child is probably having a Mobius syndrome. And in this child, you can see the way he is keeping his eyes, at very eccentric positions. And this child, to follow or fixate targets uses a head thrusting movements, very classical and very characteristic of oculomotor apraxia. This can be sometimes, if this particular sort of head thrusting movements is associated with telangiectasia, then you are looking at a child with ataxia telangiectasia. You can see obvious swelling around the eyes, which is red with the restriction of eye movements, indicates a local cause like either orbital cellulitis or a more serious sinister cause like carotid sinus or cavernous sinus thrombosis. Okay, an obvious telangiectasia can give a clue to ataxia telangiectasia, and unusual hyperphoria or hypertrophia, or a squint in which the eyes is up along with a neck tilt to the opposite sides, gives a clue to a fourth nerve palsy. Facial dysmorphism with bilateral ptosis, with finger contractures, with almost like a hypotonic face, V-shaped mouth, and a prominent forehead. Okay, with very typical oculomotor apraxia, can give rise to dysmorphic conditions like Joubert syndrome. So this child is having a Joubert syndrome. This child is having a fourth nerve palsy. This child is having ataxia telangiectasia, and this child is having cavernous sinus thrombosis. So maximum clues can be obtained from general physical examination with repeated training and practice. So once you start examining your eye movements, we go systematically. We have to see what is outside the eyes. Are you able to see any obvious swellings? How are the eyelids? Is there any obvious ptosis? What are the size of the eyes? Is there enophthalmosis or exophthalmosis? And what are the eyelid abnormalities? And then, of course, we look for the anterior segment of the eyes. We look for the pupils. Are the pupils equal and reactive to light and accommodation, right? And all of us should train to use the ophthalmoscope. And how is the fundus? Okay, and how is the fundus? How is the disc? How are the vessels? Do you see any disc blurring, or do you see any hemorrhages? Right. So this is a routine, should be a routine part of your neurological examinations, checking the pupils and checking the fundus. And once you're done, pertaining to eye movements specifically, we would look for the eye movements in your 6 cardinal positions of gaze, or 9 cardinal positions of gaze in a H-like pattern. We ask to see the child in the midline, to the right, to the left. Okay, then midline up, midline and right up, midline left up, and then right side down, left side down, and midline down in a H-like pattern. So when you want to see with a single eye, it is called as duction. And when you want to see both eyes, so you should always start by seeing one eye, the right eye first in all 6 positions of gaze, and then the left eye all in 6 positions of gaze. then you should check both the right and left eye together in the 6 positions of gaze. Okay, and when we are checking for the gaze, you have to later on you should also check for saccades and smooth pursuit. I'll explain to you how we can do that. And in a comatose child, we should look for your vestibulo-ocular reflex or your doll's eye phenomena. And during the examination, we should also look for any involuntary or hyperkinetic intrusive movements like nystagmus. So once you have checked for movements, you can also look for any other unusual malalignment of the eyes in case of a weakness, whether it is in-turned eyes or out-turned eyes or upturned eyes. Okay, and you can further use simple tests like cover test and alternate cover test and the corneal light reflex test to understand the degree of malalignment. Okay, any unusual involuntary movements, as I told, like saccades or nystagmus, okay, or unusual flutter or opsoclonus or ocular bobbing, ocular dipping, or ocular myokymia may be noted. So this is your the entire scheme of having a detailed eye examination. Okay, but if you want to do it very quickly, the least you should do routinely as a practice is to check for the pupils and the fundus, the 9 cardinal positions of gaze, quickly do a cover and uncover test. Okay, so this much would help us to understand. And of course, in the meantime, observe whether there are any intrusive movements. It doesn't take more than probably 5 to 8 minutes or maybe maximum 10 minutes to do all this test in a sequence. So let's see one by one in this. Let's focus on how to check for eye movements and how to check for malalignment before we go of an idea about hypokinetic and hyperkinetic eye movements. So how do we check for eye movements? So in this particular cartoon, you can clearly see, okay, the right up, right middle, left middle gaze, okay, right down gaze, left down gaze. So these are the 9 cardinal positions of gaze. Just note this right down gaze. I put a circle here, okay, very specifically. So in order to look right and down, okay, you need the right eye inferior rectus and you need your right eye lateral rectus. You need your left eye medial rectus, okay, but you also need your left eye superior oblique, okay, to look at your right downward gaze. So this diagram probably you need to keep in mind, okay, because your oblique eye have opposite action, whereas the recti have direct action. Superior recti means up movement, inferior recti means down movements, lateral recti lateral movement, medial recti medial movement. But superior oblique eye causes opposite movement. Superior oblique eye causes your inferior movement of the eyes, and that too for your to the opposite side. They are oblique eye. They have an oblique insertion to the posterior axis of the globe. So your left superior oblique eye would help. Your left superior oblique eye would help the left eye to look towards right down and side gaze. Okay, whereas your right superior oblique eye would help to look towards left down and to the left lateral side. Okay, so this particular thing you need to remember. Your left superior oblique eye helps the eyes to see towards the right gaze and down, and your right superior oblique eye helps to see towards the left gaze and down. Okay, so this is important when you are trying to understand a superior oblique palsy or a fourth nerve palsy. So as I told initially, you should check for ductions, starting with the right eye first and then the left eye next, and then you should check both the eyes together, which is known as version. Okay, so this is in fact the same schema for your left eye. Your left superior oblique eye helps to look down towards your right gaze. Okay, so please remember that your left superior oblique eye helps in looking at your right down gaze. So how do we check for saccades? Stay at a distance of around 1 meter or 100 centimeter apart from your the patient. Okay, and stand in the middle. Ask your child or the patient to look in the center and use 2 targets, usually the fingers, okay, 30 centimeters apart, right? Instead of 2 fingers, you can also use either 2 pen or 2 bright color objects like 2 red color toys if it's like a small kid, right? And what you're supposed to do for saccades, as I told you, saccades are those small, fast jerks which initiates your eye towards a movement. So once you keep your hands together, you need to move your one hand and the another hand alternatingly very fast. Like the examiner would move your right finger fast, wiggle the right finger fast, and then wiggle the left finger fast. So as you can see in this cartoon, the patient should see the examiner first and then quickly see the right target and then quickly see the left target. So there is like rapid jerks towards the right side and the middle and the left side. These rapid jerks are called as saccades. So if there is a problem in your frontal eye field or your frontal lobe, you can have issue with the saccades. So if there's a problem in your basal ganglia or cerebellar networks, you can have a problem in your saccades. So you can have problem either in initiating a saccade, or sometimes your saccades can become very fast. In such case, they are called as ocular flutter or opsoclonus. So saccades are not nystagmus. What is the difference? Saccade has only one component of a jerk, whereas nystagmus has a to and fro component, a fast component and a slow component. So that is the most important difference between a saccade and a nystagmus. And then you need to check for a smooth pursuit. You can use a bright color target like a red toy or a red pen or your finger, and slowly you can start from one end of the gaze, like one end of the right gaze to the other end of the gaze, like from the right gaze to the end of the left gaze, and you move the target very slowly, and the patient or the child should follow your target slowly, okay, and you should observe the smoothness of the movement without any interruption. Okay, so this type of smooth movement is called as smooth pursuit, which is controlled by your parieto-temporo-occipital junction networks influencing your brainstem. So impairment in smooth pursuit can be seen in many neurodegenerative conditions, okay, and usually they are interrupted by either nystagmus or by saccades. So as you can see here, saccades are like moving your eyes rapidly from one target to the another target in the form of rapid jerks, and smooth pursuits is like following one target very slowly and continuously. So in a comatose child or a comatose patient lying in the intensive care unit, you can check for vestibulo-ocular reflex, or also known as the doll's eye phenomena, which is nothing but you move your eyes gently from one side to the another side, and the eyes move in the opposite side. As you can see in this diagram, when your head moves to the right, the eyes moves to the left. When your head moves to the left, the eyes moves to the right. Okay, so these sort of vestibulo-ocular reflex, or the eyes moving smoothly to the opposite side, requires a significant coordination from your cerebral cortex and the brainstem. There are extensive networks which can control your vestibulo-ocular reflex. So one of the highly sensitive signs that we can pick up in an intensive care unit is that if there is loss of vestibulo-ocular reflex or a restriction of vestibulo-ocular reflex, it indicates there's a diffuse involvement of your reticular activating system and your vestibular networks. It's a diffuse involvement, or there's a diffuse injury, okay? And if this is completely absent, if your vestibulo-ocular reflex is completely absent, it's a very poor sign, which means that there's a significant brainstem injury. So a restriction of your doll's eye movement can indicate a diffuse brain injury, whereas a complete loss of your vestibulo-ocular reflex can indicate a significant brainstem injury. So having understood how to check for movements or cardinal movements, you should also quickly check for malalignment, especially many children or many adults can present with a squint. So if there's a squint is very acute with the sudden onset diplopia, it's of course definitely neurological, but children can have a long-standing squint due to a primary ocular issue as well. So at least as a neurologist, we should have some basic idea about how to check for malalignment, some basic information, okay? So what we can do, the easiest one is to do a Hirschberg test or the corneal right reflex test, where you sit in the middle and your child sits in front of you. Use the torchlight, okay, right from the middle, you hit the torchlight like just above the nose of the child, and you see how the light rays hit on both the sides of the eyes, okay? So normally your both the dots of your torchlight should fall equally on both part of your pupils in the center, okay? It should not hit your iris the other way. It should hit in the center of your pupils. But if there is like, in this case, if there is like a ISO deviation, the light ray or the light dot, instead of falling on the midline, falls onto the close to the iris or the lateral border of your pupils. And if there is a exo deviation if there is a exotropia, the light rays would fall more medially close to the middle part of your pupils, okay? So if there is a esotropia, your light rays falls close to the lateral aspect of the pupils, and if there is an exo deviation, your light rays falls more to the medial aspect or the medial border of your pupils, okay? So this is a very simple test and a very sensitive test, easy to pick up your esotropia or exotropia, but a child needs to cooperate for this. And then you can do a cover test. In a cover test, it's usually done for children with a very obvious squint, okay, but it is just done to understand whether this particular squint is a paralytic squint or a non-paralytic squint, okay? In a paralytic squint, as you can understand, the eyes do not move. Okay, whereas in a non-paralytic squint, the eyes can move. Okay, a paralytic squint is usually because of injury to the brainstem or injury to the cranial nerves. So in a cover test, what you need to do is that you just cover the normal eye and you look at the movement of the eye that has the squint. In a case of a non-paralytic squint, usually because of congenital squint, once you cover the normal looking eye, the eye which is having a squint would then move on to another primary position. Okay, whereas in a case of a paralytic squint, once you cover the normal eye, the eyes that is having the squint does not move, it stays in the position as it was. So you do for a very obvious manifest squint, you just cover the eyes which is looking normal, and as you can see in this diagram, the eye which is initially suddenly goes to another primary position because the child here is having a non-paralytic squint or a congenital squint. So you cover the normal looking eye and you observe the other looking eye which is an obvious squint, and you observe the degree of deviation. Okay, so the presence of a deviation like in this particular cartoon indicates that the child is having a non-paralytic squint. And in an alternate cover test, it is almost the same principle, but instead of covering one eye, you sort of rapidly shift in the cover between the right eye and the left eye. So you do shift like right eye, left eye, right eye, left eye. The principle is almost like as if you're looking for your relative afferent pupillary dilatation or RAPD test, okay, or the rapid swinging torchlight test. You sort of rapidly shift your cover between your right eye and the left eye, and you quickly see the eye which you have just uncovered. Okay, like for example, in this case, if you rapidly shift the cover between the right eye and the left eye, like here, okay, you shift between the right eye and the left eye, and once you move from the left eye, if this left eye comes out, okay, it means that there was a inward squint towards the left eye. But as you can see here, this is done usually for manifest squint. Like in this cartoon, both these children had a normally looking eyes without any squint. So one of the differences between an alternate cover test and cover test is that an alternate cover test is done for children who do not have a very obvious squint, but you suspect that there is probably a latent squint or a hidden squint. So these two children do not have a very obvious squint, but once you do the alternate cover test or a rapid cover and uncover test, you understand that there is a hidden squint. In this case, like it is a hidden esotropia in the left eye. So you rapidly alternate, and once you uncover from the left eye, the hidden esotropia becomes movement. So you can see the eye moving outwards. So once you see an eye movement, moving outwards, you know there is a hidden esotropia. And if you see an eye moving inwards, you know that there is a hidden exophoria. You don't call it as tropia, you call it as phoria. For a latent squint, you use the term phoria instead of tropia. So when the eye moves outward, okay, once you remove, you know there was a hidden esophoria, and if the eye moves inwards, once you remove the cover, you know there is a hidden exophoria or a hidden outward squint. Okay, so you alternatingly shift your cover, you observe the eye which was underneath the cover. When you observe the deviations of the uncovered eyes, the presence of obvious deviation implies that the squint present and it was very latent. So this is a alternate cover test. So what are the scenarios with reduced eye movements? So after understanding and taking an examination, we'll see through some of the scenarios with reduced eye movements and increased eye movements. Okay, so some of the scenarios with reduced eye movements, as usual, as we know, are a congenital squint, which is a non-neurological cause, or a paralytic squint. And you can have conditions like ophthalmoparesis, or you can have a reduced eye movements in a comatose child. Okay, so I repeat, so the conditions where you see reduced eye movements are children having congenital squint, or children having paralytic squint either because of third nerve, fourth nerve, or sixth nerve palsy, or children having a bilateral ophthalmoparesis because of either myasthenia gravis, or children who have a restricted eye movements with encephalopathy, like comatose children in encephalopathy. So we'll quickly see through these scenarios. Like this is a 4-year-old child with deviations in 6 months. As you can see, that's a very obvious right eye esotropia, and the left eye is normal in a cardinal position. Okay, and once you know that the child is wearing glasses, the right eye achieves a new primary position in midline. So you very easily understand that this is a congenital non-paralytic squint. Okay, so they usually do not have any diplopia, but because they don't use their particular eye, the eye with the squint can have amblyopia and a reduced vision. So there's a significant risk of amblyopia if you not treat a squint like for more than 6 years. So preferably the eye which is having a squint should be encouraged to move by patching the normal eye. This is the principle of patching. Otherwise, the eye which does not move becomes lazy or ambilopic, right? So the cover deviation here shows exodeviation of the right eye. There is no neurological symptoms. You need to send to ophthalmologist who will prescribe the adequate glasses. So this is an example of a typical right eye esotropia. So in terms of strabismus, the strabismus that we neurologists are worried about are neurological strabismus or a neurological squint.
9 o'clock.
Because of paralysis, either having a brainstem lesion or a brainstem tumor or a brainstem demyelination and so on. So the onset is very important. If it's like a congenital onset or a very hidden or very insidious onset, I'm not worried. But if it's an acute onset, I'm definitely worried. Okay. If it is present since early infancy, it probably indicates more of a congenital strabismus. And how far is the deviation? Is the deviation very intermittent? Some children with mild exophorias can have, bilateral divergent squint when they are tired. Okay. Or if you have a very intermittent squint, you should also think about conditions like myasthenia gravis. Does it occur only with certain positions of gaze, which can give a clue towards the different palsy? So if, for example, if there is only obvious squint towards looking at lateral gaze, it's probably a sixth nerve palsy. Right. And again, if the deviation, the squint is monocular, binocular, or alternating between the right eye and the left eye. So if there are associated neurological symptoms like headache, difficulty in walking, weakness, double vision, progressive, then you are worried about a neurological illness. Is there any family history of myopia, hypermetropia, strabismus, amblyopia? Is there any history of toxin or medication exposure? All these things can give a clue to different types of squint. So when do you refer to an ophthalmologist who's having a squint or a small baby who's having a squint? So consistent esotropia at any age, okay? Generally, newborns can have some degree of esotropia, which is considered as normal, but they don't have any esotropia from 4 months of age. So if children have a very persistent esotropia after or from 4 age of age, then you should think about unusual paralysis or unusual lesions in the brain, and you should refer to an ophthalmologist as well as a neurologist, okay? Or if you feel that there is a cover test which reveals a deviation, meaning by that there is a non-paralytic squint or a corneal reflex which is positive, after 4 months of age, requires definitive referral to an ophthalmologist for patching to prevent amblyopia. And if a parent is concerned, highly concerned about malalignment as well, you should refer to an ophthalmologist. But when do you refer to a neurologist? So any acute onset squint that is paralytic, your cover test shows no deviation, okay? And that if there are signs of papilledema, there are signs of raised ICT, if there are signs of encephalopathy, or any other prognostic neurological signs with squint, you should refer to a neurologist. So let us see this case. This child is an 11-year-old boy who's having 2 weeks history of headache and double vision. Okay, as you can see, there is in the right eye there is an adducting nystagmus, but there is a restriction of eye movements to the right extreme lateral gaze. Similarly, there is a nystagmus on the left eye medially, but the child is not able to abduct the left eye laterally. Okay, so there is some nystagmus which you can see on the bilateral adduction, but there is a clear bilateral abduction. I can see as I'm looking for a monocular by closing the right eye. As you can see, there's a clear abduction weakness on your lateral gaze. So this clearly indicates that there is a bilateral sixth nerve palsy. Okay, and this nystagmus is because of opposing action of your medial recti. Okay, this is because of law of equal innervation. Okay, so if one side is weak, the other side generally takes over. So there will be some extraneous movements. So here you can see some medial nystagmus because of weakness of your lateral rectus. So there is a bilateral lateral rectus with headache and double vision and a papilledema. So here it becomes bilateral sixth nerve palsy, right? So this is a progressive, this is a false localizing sign, okay? So, but you need to worry about brain tumors. So here this child had a cerebellar midline medulloblastoma which caused raised ICT, and subsequently the child had a bilateral sixth nerve palsy. Children can have bilateral sixth nerve palsy after raised ICT because the sixth nerve has a very long intracranial course, okay, and it is more prone by raised ICP because it also passes through the arachnoid space. So it is prone to your fluctuations in your intracranial pressure. So this child is having a bilateral sixth nerve paralysis because of raised intracranial pressure. Okay. So this child is having a monoocular restriction of eye movements. The right eye is down and out. Again, acute to subacute history of 2 to 3 weeks with high grade fever. redness around your right orbital eyelid, okay, with a red suffused conjunctiva, okay. That is diplopia on lateral gaze. As you can understand, okay, after treatment, the eye swelling has reduced, but still the eyes is down and out. So what happens when we examine this child? It's a painful diplopia. The eyes is down and out, the pupils are dilated, okay. So it clearly indicates a third nerve involvement, because once your pupils are involved, it indicates a clear third nerve involvement. There is adduction weakness, abduction weakness. So both third and sixth nerve is involvement. So this sort of combination of third nerve and the sixth nerve with almost eye which doesn't move, which is monoocular, is clearly indicative of cavernous sinus involvement. So this child immediately needs a imaging to look for cavernous sinus thrombosis, okay. So a monoocular involvement indicates, okay, with multiple cranial nerves can indicate a cavernous sinus where all multiple cranial nerves converge together. So third nerve palsy has multiple localizations. One of the localization I told you is at the level of cavernous sinus, where the third nerve, fourth nerve, the fifth nerve, and the sixth nerve all pass close abutting your internal carotid artery. The other location is your brainstem. So your third nerve syndrome can be involved in your brainstem lesions, okay, but a brainstem syndrome classically will have a crossed hemiparesis. For example, if there is a right side third nerve palsy, okay, you will have a left-sided hemiparesis. So if you see this sort of combination, right-sided third nerve palsy, right-sided eye which is having diplopia, down and out with pupillary dilatation, with a left-sided hemiplegia, you should think about a ixol or a tumor which is in the right side of your midbrain. But if you see a right side eyes which is down and out, but also hemiparesis on the same side, right side, then it's a very dangerous sign. It is also known as Hutchinson sign. It indicates a progressive mass lesion with herniation, okay. So this Hutchinson sign is, or a Carnohan notch sign, is because of opposite side. For example, the left side uncle, the left side tumor or a left side lesion pressing onto your right side midbrain and your right side corticospinal tract by pressing onto your right side of the uncus, okay. So a progressive mass lesion on one side can cause a can cause a other side third nerve palsy and other side hemiparesis, okay. So this is a sign of an impending herniation, impending unilateral herniation, okay. It's a very dangerous sign. It is known as Hutchinson sign. So again, I repeat, if you see one side third nerve palsy and opposite side hemiparesis, it is a brainstem syndrome. But if you see a one side third nerve palsy with the same side hemiparesis, it means that the lesion is there on the opposite side. It may be a brain tumor which is pressing the other side of the brainstem and the other side of the uncus down. So it is a sign of herniation. A cavernous sinus thrombosis, as I just told you, is involvement of multiple nerves like third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. And demyelination syndrome can involve the brainstem and can cause patchy, isolated cranial neuropathies or cranial nerve syndromes. Okay. So this is another example of a 15-year-old with an acute onset head tilt towards the right, okay. So he's having an acute head tilt towards the right, and he's having double vision, okay, which is more prominent on seeing down. And as you can see in this eye, on cardinal gaze, on primary gaze, he's having his left eye, which is slightly on the uppish position, or such is slightly on the hypertropic position, okay. So can you guess where could be his lesion? Okay, can you guess where could be his lesion? There is no restriction on lateral gaze. There is no restriction on medial gaze, okay. There is no restriction on up gaze, but there is a restriction on down gaze, on looking towards the opposite side. In this child, there was difficulty of the eyes to move downwards and to the right, the left eye to move downwards and to the right. So there was a restriction to the right side of the gaze, and looking down, the diplopia also increased. So can you guess where could be the lesion? So let us see again. So this left eye has a slight hypertropia. All of you can see this very clearly. And here, surprisingly, the patient prefers to keep the head tilted towards the right side. So there is a squint on the left eye, but he prefers to keep the eye on the head tilted toward the right side. And by keeping the head tilted toward the right side, his diplopia or the double vision is less. And as you can see here, even the degree of squint is less, or the squint becomes less prominent when he sort of compensatorily keeps his head tilted towards the opposite side. But when we ask to tilt the head towards the same side where there was a squint, that is towards the left eye, okay, the squint sort of increased and diplopia sort of increased. So the diplopia worsened on tilting the head to the left side. His squint also worsened towards by tilting the head towards the left side. Okay. So a diplopia which becomes better on tilting the head towards the right, but a diplopia which worsens on tilting the head towards the same side of the squint. This test is known as head tilt test. So in a head tilt test, the diplopia or the squint worsens on tilting the head towards the same side of the lesion. So how can we explain this? This is because of a left superior oblique palsy or the left cranial nerve palsy. So the left superior oblique nerve palsy will cause a contralateral head tilt and a diplopia by looking towards the opposite side. Okay. So as you can see here, on the right tilt, his squint is better, but on the left tilt, his diplopia sort of or squint becomes worsens. So what is the primary positions of gaze? I told you before itself. To look towards right gaze and down, you need the left superior oblique. So the left superior oblique helps in looking the left eye towards the right side and down, and your right superior oblique helps in looking the right eye towards the left side of the gaze, left and down. Okay, so each superior obliques has an opposite action and helps in the gaze towards the opposite side. So in case there is a left superior oblique palsy, there is a difficulty or a gaze paralysis or a gaze weakness towards right gaze and down, right down gaze. So why there is a diplopia on down on looking down? Because as we know, the superior oblique helps in down gaze in oblique position. Okay, like your left superior oblique helps in right down gaze, and your right superior oblique helps in left down gaze. So in case there is a paralysis, your antagonist muscles like your inferior oblique does a overaction and sort of pulls your eyes to go up. That is the reason for your obvious hypertropic squint on the same eye. So your inferior oblique sort of pulls the eyes up. So as a compensatory position, a patient has to keep your head tilted towards the opposite side so that your eyes are aligned. So your eyes are aligned. So there is always a contralateral head tilt. So this contralateral head tilt is actually compared to the position of a crow. Okay, just imagine the crow has a left superior oblique palsy. So the crow has a left superior oblique palsy, and the crow sort of tilts the head to the right. So the eyes are in a straight plane and the squint is sort of reduced. So with the left eye, he is able to see right side and down. Okay, so this is sort of one example so that you can remember an example of your gaze palsies. And so a triad of features of gaze palsy is that there is a adduction in down gaze to the opposite side, there is a head tilt to the opposite side, there's a diplopia that worsens on the opposite side. So and diplopia also worsens by tilting the head towards the same side. So the fourth nerve has a typical triad with impaired adduction in down gaze to the opposite side, head tilt to the opposite side, and increase in diplopia when the head is tilted to the same side. Okay. So this is another child, so completing the fourth nerve palsy, which is a bit tricky. You need some understanding to understand how the heads get tilted and how there is like diplopia, right? So this is a child with oculomotor apraxia. Okay, as I told you, it's a problem in maintaining a smooth pursuit and in maintaining a saccades. Because of unusual saccades, the child has to thrust his head to look at the unusual targets. In this diagram, you can clearly see in this video, the examiner moves the toy, okay, right, and the child has to see as he moves the toy, the child has to turn his head to look at the toy, These are known as head thrusting movements of oculomotor apraxia. There is no paralysis of individual movements, but there is frequent head shifting towards target despite intact cranial nerves. So apraxia means unable to perform a sequence of movements despite having a normal motor system and a normal sensory system. So in this scenario, the child is having no oculomotor nerve palsy, but still he has to move his head thrust to look towards a target. So this is a clear-cut case of oculomotor apraxia. So this could be seen in conditions like in Joubert syndrome, Gaucher's disease, okay, ataxia telangiectasia, and you can have a congenital oculomotor apraxia and so on. So it's an interesting clinical sign which can give a lead to the diagnosis. So coming to the situations of restricted eye movements in a child with in a comatose child. So this child had a acute onset encephalopathy with raised ICT, okay, and altered sensorium. As you can see, his eyes are divergent and are not moving. Okay, there is a restriction of gaze. Okay, but I've not shown the video of how you look for conjugate gazes. You just need to move the head right side and left side. The eyes doesn't move like in this child. It's a divergent gaze. Okay, so a divergent gaze is one of the probably the initial sign that you can see in child with encephalopathy. This is because your thalamus and hypothalamic control of eye movements towards your longitudinal fasciculus and brainstem becomes lost. So your eyes stays in a divergent position. Okay. So this child is a comatose child with because of hypoxic or brain injury because of meningoencephalitis. His dorsal eye movements are restricted. His pupils are normal. His individual eye movements are not restricted. He's having hyperreflexia, meningeal signs. Okay, and the CSF shows lymphocytic predominance, and his MRI shows acute necrotizing encephalopathy or bithalamic signal changes. So like this child with divergent eyes in an ICU, there can be many eye signs or many restricted eye movements or many intrusive or excessive eye movements in children with encephalopathy in ICU. It's a different topic per se, but two things that we need to understand is that if your eyes is tonically fixed towards one side, okay, so maybe you will be called as a neurologist or a pediatrician to the ICU, telling that probably the child is having a seizure because his eyes is persistently fixed to the right side or his eyes is persistently fixed to the left side. So how would you quickly understand where is the problem? Like we'll see in the next video. Like in this child, okay, if the intensivist call you, I am suspecting a seizure, the child is having a persistent gaze towards the right side. Okay, so how do you anatomically think, okay, is that a seizure or is that something else? Okay, like here there is an gaze initially which was fixed for a long time towards the right side, and then there was a fix which was gaze fixing onto the left side. So these sort of fixed gaze deviations, okay, can either indicate a seizure, of course, but can also indicate sometimes brain injuries or brain lesions like stroke or brain tumors or a brain damage. Okay, so how do we understand that? So for the eyes to be kept in midline, okay, for the eyes to be in midline, you need opposing action of both frontal lobe centers. Okay, there are like frontal eye field centers which keeps your eyes in midline. Okay, so let us examine. Let us just give an example. So if your right frontal eye field center is very hyperactive and it is more stronger than the left side, it will push the eyes towards your left side. And similarly, if your right frontal eye field center is very active, okay, more than the right side, it will push your eyes towards the right side like this. Okay, so a right frontal eye field center usually try to push the eyes towards the left side, and your left frontal eye field center tries to push the eyes towards the right side. That is an opposing actions. Okay, so just imagine if this side is lost. Just imagine if this side is lost. For example, there is a brain damage or a stroke or a left-sided MCI infarct. Your right frontal eye field becomes very active and it pushes your eyes tonically towards your left side gaze. Okay, so there will be a tonic gaze deviation to the left side. I hope that's clear. If there is a brain infarct or a brain injury to the left frontal eye field, your right frontal eye field center will tonically push your eyes towards a left tonic eye gaze. So in this case, the eye would be tonically deviated towards the left side. Like this is the example. Okay, if there is a brain damage, for example, in the left side, the eyes are tonically deviated to the left side. So one way of easily remember this is that, okay, the Harrison's medicine, Harrison's internal principle gives one simple way of remembering it. The eyes always look towards the brain away from the brainstem. The eyes always looks towards the brain away from the brainstem. So if there is a brain injury or a cortical injury, the eyes would look towards the same side. Okay, this is because your right frontal eye field center is very active. But if there is a brainstem injury, the eyes looks towards your opposite side. For example, if there is a brainstem injury on your left side, there will be a right tonic gaze. So one easy way to remember is that these two, the first two diagrams, okay, I'm not telling the third diagram, the first two diagrams, the eyes always looks towards the brain and away from the brainstem. This is because of action of frontal eye field centers. Now what happens in this scenario in case of a seizure? In case of a seizure, there is a hyperactive frontal eye field center. So in case of seizure which originates from the left frontal eye field center, it's an irritative focus, so it will push the eyes to the opposite side. So a left frontal eye field center will push the eyes towards the right side. So if you have a child having a right persistent gaze like this, having a right persistent gaze, only there are two possibilities. There is a left-sided irritative lesion or a right-sided damaged lesion. Okay, I repeat again. If you see a persistent right tonic gaze, there are only two possibilities. You have a left-sided irritative seizure foci, or you have a right-sided damaged foci, okay, or a right-sided damaged foci. So this is the easiest way to understand your frontal eye fields and how they work, okay, and what causes fixed gaze deviations. So checking for gaze scales passes can give a clues to encephalopathy. They can give a clues towards your localization. So like a fixed right tonic gaze can indicate probably that's a seizure arising from the left frontal lobe, or there is a right-sided frontal lobe infarct. Okay, so it can give a clues towards localization, but movements in the PICU or intensive care unit are very dynamic and they keep changing. So frequent examination is must. Okay, they can indicate your brainstem injury and brainstem death in case of children having significant encephalopathy. If you want to check the brainstem, you can look for doll's eye movement. Okay, absence of doll's eye movement indicates there is a brainstem injury. So that can help in certification of a brainstem death. Certain red flag signs like Hutchinson's sign, okay, is very, very important because it indicates impending herniation and you need to react urgently. Okay, so I hope this gives an understanding regarding eyes in a comatose child. And of course, certain involuntary movements, which I didn't give idea about, ocular bobbing, ocular dipping also can give certain clues in ICU. So coming back again to restriction eye movements or reduced eye movements, this is a child who's having a bilateral reduced eye movements, okay, in all the gazes, in up gaze, in down gaze, in lateral gaze, and mid gaze, okay. But this restriction of eye gazes is more in the evenings, okay, is more when he becomes tired, okay. But when he gets up from the morning, it is not present. So as we clearly understand, there is some degree of ptosis as well. This child is having a myasthenia gravis, an ocular myasthenia gravis, with a restriction of gaze both in the up gaze, down gaze, mid gaze, and lateral gaze, okay, with a fatigable sort or an intermittent sort of ophthalmoparesis, okay. So here you have to, of course, evaluate for your myasthenia gravis by sending antibodies and looking for thymoma. So check whether there is the pupils is also involved, okay. But if pupils are involved along with ophthalmoparesis, okay, then it's a complete ophthalmoparesis, okay. If pupils are involved, that is both external and internal, then it's called as a complete ophthalmoparesis. But if the pupils are spared, then it becomes an incomplete ophthalmoparesis, okay. So myasthenia gravis can cause a complete bilateral external ophthalmoparesis, okay. But CPEO or chronic progressive external ophthalmoparesis does not cause a complete ophthalmoparesis. Pupils are spared. It usually indicates a mitochondrial disorder. So these are the two differentials for a bilateral ophthalmoparesis, whether it is a myasthenia gravis or whether it is a progressive ophthalmoparesis. So a complete ophthalmoparesis can be sometimes seen in Guillain-Barré syndrome, Miller-Fisher syndrome, okay. Whereas progressive external ophthalmoparesis is seen in conditions like myasthenia gravis and CPEO. Okay, so causes for complete ophthalmoparesis. Sorry, I told myasthenia gravis. I'm sorry for that. Myasthenia gravis does not produce complete ophthalmoparesis. Myasthenia gravis and mitochondrial disorder produces external ophthalmoparesis. Pupils are not involved. But in Guillain-Barré syndrome, snake bite, okay, botulinism, bilateral brainstem hemorrhage, you can have a complete ophthalmoparesis in which the pupils are dilated and there's restriction of complete eyeball movements. Okay, so this is again a significant clues for localization. So another scenario where you can come across with the restricted eye movements also with significant treatment implications. Okay, like in this child, there was like a 2-week history of a double vision with restricted movements of the left eye, with the restricted movement of the left eye. Okay, so this child is having restriction towards looking at the right side gaze while checking version. Okay, but the individual eye movements are okay. So how would you assess this? So individually is right eye movements are okay. Individually is left eye movements are okay. But when you want to look for version, that is in cases, he's not able to look towards the right side, but is able to look towards the left side. But when you check the individual left eye movements are normal, both up, down, okay, in and out, everything is normal. So how do you account for this? So this child is having a hypokinetic movement on the right gaze. His left eye doesn't move. Okay. especially when you are looking for version. Individual eye movements are normal, but on gaze to the right side, there is a restriction of your left eye adduction. Okay, there is no restriction of left eye in superior or inferior gaze. There is normal pupillary reaction, and there's a dissociated nystagmus on your right eye on abduction. On this eye has some small nystagmus, and this eye has a medial adduction deficit. So this sort of unusual manifestation in which monocular palsy is not present, but when you're looking for conjugated gazes, there is a palsy is seen typically with your internuclear ophthalmoplegia because of involvement of medial longitudinal fasciculus. Okay, so in this situation, the child is having a left-sided INO. Okay, this child is having a left-sided INO. Just like I told you for a fourth nerve palsy. Okay, for example, if there's a fourth nerve palsy on your left eye, there is difficulty in gaze towards your right downside. Exactly the same point. If there is a INO, there is always a difficulty in gaze towards the opposite side. So a left-sided INO produces difficulty in gaze towards the right side, and a right-sided INO produces difficulty in gaze towards your left side. So how can we explain this? So this is one easy way to remember. Your INO and fourth nerve palsy all produces a gaze difficulty to the opposite side. So how can we explain this? Okay, so some degree of knowing the anatomy is required. So your sixth nerve and the third nerve nuclei, okay, are interconnected on the opposite side by a fasciculus which runs right from your hypothalamus and down, known as your medial longitudinal fasciculus. As you can see in this diagram, the left-sided sixth nerve is connected to the right-sided third nerve nuclei, okay, by means of a fasciculus called as medial longitudinal fasciculus. Okay, so your left sixth nerve is connected to your right third nerve by a fasciculus called as medial longitudinal fasciculus. Okay, so in this situation, if I want to see towards the right eye abduction, okay, right eye abduction, my right sixth nerve nuclei is okay, so I'm able to see right side. Okay, but my left eye or the left thing is restricted, because in order to see this, in order to for my the left third nerve to move, okay, it has to synchronize with your left sixth nerve nucleus. Okay, so the left sixth nerve would move, but because the interconnection between your left sixth nerve and your the right sixth nerve and left third nerve is not there, there is a restriction, or there is limitation of adduction of your left eye. Okay, so I repeat again. So the medial longitudinal fasciculus connects your left third nerve nuclei with your right sixth nerve nuclei. It connects your left third nerve nuclei with your right sixth nerve nuclei. So if I want to see towards the right gaze, my right-sided abduction is present, but my left-sided adduction is limited. So this is what I told you. Left-sided INO will produce a limitation of gaze towards your right side, because your connecting fasciculus between your third nerve and sixth nerve is interrupted. Right, so these connecting bundles can be affected anywhere from the pons to that of your midbrain. So one important clue is that we always say the site of the INO from the site where there is a limitation of adduction. So in this case, there is a left-sided INO. Okay. So what would happen if there is a bilateral INO? Let us imagine if there is a bilateral INO, like in this case, okay, or it is also called as a walleye phenomena. Okay, the convergence is intact because convergence has a different pathways. But if you ask him to see towards the left gaze, the right eye cannot adduct, and if you ask him to see towards the right gaze, the left eye cannot adduct. If you ask him to see towards the left gaze, the right eye cannot adduct, and if you ask him to see towards the right gaze, the left eye cannot adduct. This is because of bilateral medial longitudinal fasciculus lesion. So this sort of eye is called as a walled eye, in which bilateral adduction is impacted, or a walled eye bilateral INO phenomena. Okay. Whereas one important clue is that the convergence is intact. So this indicates that there is no paralysis, because the eyes can move inward. But when you ask to move one eye and one eye by one eye each other, it cannot move inward. So there is a bilateral failure of adduction. This is a bilateral INO. So just to summarize internal ophthalmoplegia, it's an adduction failure towards one eye. Okay, for example, if there's a left-sided INO, there's a left-sided adduction failure. So there is difficulty to see to the right side of the gaze. But the convergence reaction is intact because it is because of other brainstem pathways. The opposite eye, okay, that is the other eye which is intact, would have some degree of abduction nystagmus. This is because of law of equal innervation. This can sometimes mimic a third nerve palsy. So one of the important clues is that there is no pupillary dilatation. As you know, in a third nerve palsy, the eyes is down and out, not like this. Whereas in an INO, the eyes is in the midline position in a cardinal gaze. The independent eye movements are normal. So this comes to the last part of our discussion. What are some of the scenarios in which there are increased eye movements? So I did discuss some of these scenarios when I discussed about cerebellar disorders. You can have conditions like nystagmus, opsoclonus, and ocular flutter. Like in this child is a 7-year-old girl who has a progressive lesion, loss of walking, okay, progressively increasing stiffness over a period of 3 to 4 years, onset from around 3 to 4 years of age. You can note in this child is having spasticity, she's having intention tremors, okay. You can see that, okay, that's a generalized ataxia, but you can very clearly see a to and fro jerky nystagmus, okay, to and fro jerky nystagmus. We'll see this video again. You can see this a to and fro movement. So this is nystagmus, whereas a saccades is just a horizontal jerk. When you see this form of a pendular-like movement, okay, like a to and fro movement, sometimes there is also a component of fast, but it's predominantly a pendular nystagmus, okay, with a spasticity and ataxia. This child is having a progressive condition called as leukodystrophy, okay. So these sort of eye movements, nystagmus, can be seen in cerebellar lesions, okay, a to and fro movement. So how do you understand a nystagmus? So a nystagmus is a to and fro movement. It's because of impairment in gaze holding. There are two types of nystagmus. When you have a smooth to and fro movement, it is called as pendular movement. Both to and fro movements are equal in direction. But when you have a fast component and a slow component with jerks, they are called as horizontal nystagmus. You can have nystagmus because of just because of an ocular lesion like a lens dislocation or retinitis pigmentosa. In that condition, it is called as a ocular nystagmus. Okay, so nystagmus is not as same as saccade. Saccade has only one component, whereas nystagmus has to and fro component. Okay, neurological nystagmus mostly involves both the eyes. Okay, you cannot have a monoocular neurological nystagmus. Okay, there are very rare conditions, but in general, neurological nystagmus involves both the eyes. The jerk nystagmus or the to and fro nystagmus with a fast component and slow component is much more common than pendular nystagmus, which is a nystagmus with a equal to and fro component. Okay, so that is the difference between a pendular nystagmus and a jerky nystagmus. In a pendular nystagmus, it is almost like a pendulum, a to and fro with equal directions, whereas in a jerk nystagmus, it is a to and fro with a fast component and a slow component. So in a neurological nystagmus, there is no extinction phenomena. So if you ask to fixate a target, the nystagmus does not settle down. Whereas if it is a vestibular nystagmus, when you ask to fixate towards a target, the nystagmus can stop. A vertical nystagmus is always abnormal. It indicates either a toxin injury or a brainstem injury. A brainstem injury in the pons or the medulla or the cervicomedullary junction, okay, or a toxin can produce, like a phenytoin toxicity commonly can produce vertical nystagmus. So these are some of the common points about nystagmus. I'm not going into full details, okay, but it is important to be clear between what is a nystagmus and what is a fast horizontal saccade. So this child, like as a typical ocular nystagmus, that is like very smooth to and fro movement, okay, is also able to fixate towards a target, okay. There is no impaired vision, okay, even though the nystagmus is fast, the fundus is normal, there is no head tremor, okay, the MRI brain and orbits. So not all nystagmus is because of a cerebellar lesion or a brain injury. Some nystagmus can be very benign, like a congenital nystagmus, which sort of recovers itself by around 2 to 3 years of time, okay. It's because of some issue in fusion that the child can have this roving type of a fast nystagmus, okay, but with a good fixation ability, okay. So this is an example of your congenital nystagmus. So usually noticed in the first month of life, the cause is usually ocular. Of course, you need to rule out a retinal pathology or like a retinal coloboma or optic nerve hypoplasia. In such situation, it is called as a fusion maldevelopment nystagmus, okay. But other benign differential is a spasmus nutans, in which also the eyes movements fast, but it's very episodic and it comes very fast. I'll show the video of a spasmus nutans. Congenital nystagmus does not affect the vision. So this is a child who is having, you can notice here, I mean, he would have a very rapid eye movement with a sudden head tilt. Okay, just it would come. Right. So this child is otherwise a normal developing child. Okay. You can observe now, it will come now. We will have a sudden head tilt with a rapid eye movements. Okay. Right. Let me see where it comes. Sorry for that. I'm sorry for the delay because I'm just waiting. Yeah, here, exactly. So this is the point. Okay, you can look here again. There'll be a sudden head tilt with a rapid jerky eye movements. Okay, this is known as spasmus nutans. Here. Okay, so this sort of rapid eye movements, okay, is very benign. This is called a spasmus nutans. It is not associated with any ocular here. Rapid eye movements, okay, horizontal nystagmus. It could be monocular, binocular, with a brief head tremor and a neck torticollis. It is not associated with any loss of vision or delay in visual fixation. Okay, the children are otherwise normally developmentally children. It can persist up to 3 to 4 years. So this is your spasmus nutans. So this is a scenario where you can see a toddler with a very rapid eyelid movement and eyeball movements, which is very fast. He is photophobic, he is irritable. It is a very chaotic and a rapid eye movement. Okay, you can see now and here. So it's multi-directional, okay, very random and sort of non-stop. Okay, so this sort of child who is very irritable in a toddler less than 5 years is a very classical opsoclonus myoclonus ataxia. So this child had a 3-week history of irritability and inability to walk with this sort of high movement. So these are not seizures. These are very rapid, fast saccades, fast multi-directional saccades called opsoclonus myoclonus. Opsoclonus. Okay, if it associated with other jerky movements in limbs, it's called as opsoclonus myoclonus. Okay, you can understand how fast it is. So it is a multi-directional, chaotic, rapid, intrusive saccades or fast saccadic intrusions. Okay, it is multi-directional. If it's unidirectional, then you call it as an ocular flutter and not opsoclonus. But generally, ocular flutter would precede an opsoclonus. You will start with ocular flutter and then it changes into opsoclonus generally. But sometimes very rapidly you can have onset of opsoclonus, usually seen in children with neuroblastoma. It's a very rare condition though. Okay, ocular flutter can precede opsoclonus. Irritability is very characteristic of opsoclonus. So if you have a child with irritability and unusual eye movements, you should always never forget to rule out a neuroblastoma. So these are these rapid horizontal eye movements to and fro. Okay, sorry, rapid eye movements. Okay, called a flutter. So a rapid saccades in a horizontal direction. Okay, is called as a flutter-like eye movements. Okay, of course, can be confused with the horizontal nystagmus, but the horizontal nystagmus has a definitive fast component and a slow component. Whereas in a flutter, you will not be able to appreciate between a fast component or a slow component. So this is your ocular flutter. This can precede myoclonus. So this sort of sudden sustained eye movements, okay, or unusual eye movements with uprolling, okay, we can think about seizures, but the child is very conscious, he's aware, he's photophobic, okay. This sort of sustained eye movements is a hyperkinetic eye movement disorder called as oculogyric crisis. Here the child after diarrhea was given metoclopramide and he had this sustained and persistent uprolling of eye. So this is it's not a seizure, it can look like a seizure. This is nothing but a oculogyric crisis. So this is hyperkinetic episodic eye movements, okay, after a short illness to eccentric position, it disappeared after 24 hours. This is because of a drug like metoclopramide, okay. So it's a hyperkinetic movement disorder where eyes get sustained either upward or laterally, okay, and persistently where the child becomes irritable. So an oculogyric crisis can have a sudden, continuous or nearly sustained eccentric gaze, okay, with a normal sensorium. It can be a part of neurometabolic or a neurotransmitter disorders. In some situations, you can have oculogyric crisis. Can be seen in children after Kernicterus injury in a newborn. Seizures are definitely important differentials. You can go ahead with the EEG to make sure that there are no convulsions. So are there again some examples of episodic eye movements which can be confused or which can be confused with convulsions, okay, like this child would have this sort of rapidly uprolling eyeballs, okay, uprolling of eyes, okay, where this is nothing but a paroxysmal tonic upgaze of infancy. So not all uprolling of eyeballs is a seizure, okay. So this is the idea behind showing all this uprolling of eyeballs, because generally students and residents say uprolling of eyeballs, seizure. So not all uprolling of eyeballs is a seizure. This is called as paroxysmal tonic upgaze of infancy. This is a very benign eye condition where the child does this sort of upgaze. It disappears by around 2 to 3 years of age. Some children can have a benign essential tremor, okay. It's a seizure mimic. But this child, yes, is having episodic eye movements more with exposure to light, okay, like this, okay, as if he does this closing eye movements, okay, or with eyebrow frowning, okay, like this. So this here, he interestingly had a seizure called eyelid myoclonia. So of course, there are certain increased movements can confuse between certain seizures and certain movement disorders, etc. But as a resident should be very clear about nystagmus, all type of nystagmus, ocular nystagmus, jerky nystagmus, and pendular nystagmus. Students should be aware about opsoclonus and ocular flutter. So this is eyelid myoclonia with abscences. So that comes to the end of our discussion. So I had told about the basics of eye movement. Just to summarize, the basic of eye movements has a supranuclear control, nuclear control, and infranuclear control. The supranuclear control can be from the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum. They help in saccades and sport pursuit and gaze holding phenomena. Impairment of gaze holding can lead to nystagmus. Impairment of saccades can lead to oculomotor apraxia. Okay, so you can have your supranuclear loss of eye movement control in conditions with encephalopathy like neurodegenerative conditions, convulsions, stroke, brain infarct, neurodegenerative conditions, neurometabolic conditions, and so on. But if you're looking at paralysis per se, we are interested in the nuclear localization of the lesion and the infranuclear localization of the lesion. Okay, so always think about localization. Okay, always think about localization. Always try to categorize a movement disorder into a reduced eye movement disorder and a increased eye movement disorder. Do a proper sequence of examination. In examination, we look at how the eyes are aligned. Okay, we look at the cardinal positions of gaze, we look at the pupils, we look at the fundus, right? You have to check for individual eyes first, and then you have to check for both the eyes. And once you have a conclusion between a hypokinetic eye disorder and a hyperkinetic eye disorder, you can think about anatomy between a supranuclear, nuclear, and a infranuclear lesion. Okay, so in the entire presentation, probably a student, a resident should go back and read about internuclear ophthalmoparalysis, where, as you know, one side of internuclear ophthalmoparalysis would cause restriction of gaze to the opposite side with a restriction in adduction. Should read about fourth nerve palsies. How about one side fourth nerve palsy would cause impairment of down gaze to the opposite side, and how there is a contralateral head tilt with a fourth nerve palsy. Okay, a student should know about internuclear ophthalmoplegia. A student should know about fourth nerve palsy, third nerve palsy, sixth nerve palsy, and a student should know about opsoclonus, ocular flutter, and nystagmus. Okay, so that would sum up. And of course, to understand some of the eye movement in an intensive care setup, like a tonic eye gaze deviation or a restricted eye movements in the case of a encephalopathic child. Okay, so these are some of the ideas behind taking this particular session. Okay, if you have any doubts, of course, you can mail to me, and you can, of course, give your suggestions and comments. Thank you for your